class and everyone else. In this video, I'm going to talk about color theory, and more specific, the problems of color theory. There are some problems with it. Now, problems is probably a bit of a harsh word. Instead, I'm going to call it limitations. This is a follow-up video. In another video, I talked about an introduction to color theory and how that color theory is based off patterns. I encourage you to watch a full video. The link is in the description, but I do want to give a summary of it. So in the last video, I talked about the different harmony rules in traditional color theory, and we can see on the screen the many variations of them and the shapes that they make. But what I really went over in the last video is how each of these can actually be redefined as simple AAA or ABA patterns. And if you look on the screen, you can see each one has one of those two patterns. Not only do they have these patterns, but many of the traditional harmony rules are actually related to each other by the same pattern, as we can see through this sequence. There's some new harmony rules that come out that are identical or nearly identical to the other ones, but are often not mentioned, but work just as well. I then showed how you can sort of string all these patterns together and create something much more sophisticated. And I'm not going to go into all the details about how I created this. That'll be for a follow-up video. But we can see that this color palette just has an AB pattern. We do have to remember that this color wheel is actually a three-dimensional cone going into the screen, and length A does equal the same length with perspective shortening taken into account. Now, traditional color theory is not as insightful as you may have thought, right? Because the way it usually works is you usually start with one color. Let's say we're going to start with the color red. Now, if I were to select more colors, the way traditional color theory would work is I'd go through all the harmony rules and I'd find a bunch of colors that work together. But let's see how that plays out, all right? So I could start with complementary, which is just the opposite color. And I'll go through these quickly because split complementary, I just move them apart. Analogous or similar to my input color, red in this case. I can go triadic, which is 3 equally spaced, or tetraadic, which is 4 equally spaced. And as we saw in the last video, there's actually a couple variations. And so these are all the standard harmony rules I reviewed in the last video, all laid out on one another. But just to make this more clear, I'll put up this animation here. When I start with the color red, any other color on this color wheel will match red in some harmony rule. Now, one of the things you might be thinking to yourself is, well, I thought the purpose of color theory was that it told me what color matches. But if I look at all of color theory, it's really saying all colors match. So then why do I need color theory in the first place? All colors match together. But let me just step back and simplify this for a second, because really what this is saying fundamentally is any two colors or any two hues work with each other. The questions then become, once you start adding more than two hues, or more importantly, what happens when you start adding tints and shades? Then some colors do work better than other colors, and I think it's patterns that allow us to explain it. And again, this is very useful in understanding the rest of the limitations I'm going to show. Now, the second limitation I actually think is the most interesting, and really it's probably the reason why I've made all these videos in the first place. It's also a direct consequence of the first limitation. Traditional color theory, almost anywhere you go, any tool, you have to start with one color, just like I did before. You start with red. And then you sort of look through the various harmony rules and find what color works with red. But I'm going to put the red dot right up in here because that's where we're going to start again today, is by starting with one color with red. But based on the last limitation, we say, well, I should be able to start with any other hue on this color wheel because I just proved that there is a harmony rule that will match any other color up here. So in theory, I should be able to just place whatever color I want and get something to work. Why can't I do that? You can, as a matter of fact. In fact, I find this to be highly useful. I actually find in design this is something I really need. I often know two colors I want to start with, but I might have trouble finding the other colors I want to go with it. and I know this should work, and I wish there were some tool to make this happen. And it can be explained pretty easily through patterns. So let's just look at this. Let's just say, for example, I wanted to start with another color. Let's say I'm just going to put up one to make blue. So I'll put my blue marker up here as well. Now we can start simply by marking the distance between them, and we can say A. Right? That's distance A around the color wheel. And of course, I can continue this pattern, so I can go length A around the color wheel. It's pretty simple to understand. It's going to be green if you go around. It's just the simple triadic color wheel, of course. And there we go. Of course, I could, since this is equally spaced, I could fill in the rest of the pattern, though it's not necessarily needed. I could do that. Now I'm going to take away green for a second because there are other ways of looking at this. Now, what I'm going to do this time, I'm going to keep the red and the blue because I want to start with those colors. Those are my given, all right? And I'm going to put new colors on, cyan in this case. I'm still being pretty simple patterns here. And yellow, right up there. All right? And of course, in this case, we just have one of the standard tetradic color harmony rules shown for us. But again, I got to that not through red, but by starting with two colors, sort of limiting my choices right off the bat. Of course, there are other ways of continuing to look at this. We can also look for patterns in between the pattern. So I could take A and just split it in half, for example. So I could take a color and actually put a marker right there, halfway in between, and just highlight the new pattern as an AAA pattern. I don't even necessarily have to look all the way around the color wheel, but I've created a nice color palette just by doing that. Now, let me move on to the third limitation. And that's dealing with tints and shades. In traditional color theory, we deal with hues, and I showed how that could be broken down into simple patterns. And in the last video, I also showed how to use tints and shades, which are the addition of grays and whites. And I also showed that those are really just simple patterns as well. In traditional color theory, it doesn't really do a good job of combining the two. It doesn't really say how tints and shades work with hues. But when you realize they're all just the same set of simple patterns, it does become pretty easy just to combine those patterns together. So for example, here in the last video, I did show how a monochromatic color scheme, just like the ones we've been looking at, is just an AAA pattern. So let me show you how these patterns can be combined. So let's take an example and look at how tints and shades can be placed in the same pattern of hue. I'm just going to start by showing the standard triadic color wheel of red, blue, and green right over there. Okay. So now there's no tints and shades in this, so I have to go back to my other color wheel that shows tints and shades, and I can start to make some adjustments to this to show how it's in the pattern. And so we can see that green is just 1, 2, 3, 4 spaced around the hue, and same with blue is 1, 2, 3, 4 from green, right? So now I got to look at the white and black additions to this. So if I want to go in and create the color palette I have over on the side, I start with the pure green, which is over here. I'm just going to step towards white 1 space and then towards black 1 space and place my dot here to get this green right there. And I need to do the same with blue. If I start with the pure hue, it's here. If I step 1 down and 1 over, well, that just puts me in the same position that green was in. So I actually have to make the step 1 more time. So I step down 1 more and over 1 more and place my blue here to get this sort of saturated, darker blue color right there. And as we can see, that step between red and green is exactly the same amount of step between green and blue. Right? So that's how you can integrate the same patterns between hues, tints, and shades. Just like that. Previously, I mentioned that I've been using the RGB, or the red, green, blue color wheel, but that's not always the color wheel you see. In fact, in color theory, oftentimes you see the RYB color wheel, or the red, yellow, blue color wheel. In fact, there are many different kinds of color wheels, and traditional color theory doesn't really address what you do with the different color wheels. So let me just start by reviewing some of the options here. As we mentioned, we've been using the red, green, and blue. And here's a ring. I'm going to develop other color wheels around this. Now the first one I want to talk about is very similar to RGB. It's a CMYK color wheel with cyan, magenta, yellow, and K is black. It's basically what printers use. In fact, the CMYK and the RGB color wheel are very similar. In fact, some might even call them identical. You might see slight variations up here on the screen, and that's only because the computer is accounting for the fact that CMYK is used for printers, and so it can't get as bright as colors as an RGB color system can. The reverse of that is also true. An RGB system, which uses light, can't get quite to the blacks that inks can when using the CMYK system. But other than that, they're all pretty similar. A little more different will be the RYB color wheel, where again they're red, yellow, blue. And this is the one that you probably most often see with color theory. It's probably the one you learned growing up, and so on and so forth. And we'll see it's slightly different here. One of the big differences is green is the complement of red as opposed to cyan in our other systems. That has the effect of extending the orange and yellows longer. There's more of them in this system, and it sort of compresses the blues and purples in this system. But it's also just as valid and works just as well. But believe it or not, RYB and the rest are not the only ones. There are others as well. One of the ones that I find most interesting is the RYGB. That's right, it has 4 primary colors rather than 3 like the other systems do. In this case, yellow is the complement of blue, as it is in the RGB system, but green is the complement of red, as it is in the RYB system. This system is not used for mixing lights or inks or paints or anything like this, but it is meant to replicate how the brain and the eye sees and interprets color. And this is the reason why some people like it. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert in this, but it sort of works something like this. See, everyone generally knows that the eyes have 3 types of cone cells. We sometimes call them red, green, and blue cone cells, or long, medium, and short. But the thing is, the brain doesn't process them simultaneously. What it does is it first processes what I'll call the red and green cone cells. And so it can give you colors of red, it can give you colors in green, or it can mix together, which of course is yellow. Then it takes that combination of process and then combines it with the blue, processed with the blue. Right? So this is why a system like this, where red is a complement of green, that makes sense because that's the first processing of cone cells that happens. And then it sort of makes sense that yellow is the complement of blue because that's the second process, is the combination of red and green processed simultaneously with blue. And so it's meant to more specifically represent how we might see. And in fact, I actually like this color wheel a lot. How the colors are distributed around the color wheel seems more even than many other color systems. However, I don't really use it because it is more complicated than needed. I want to show you one more type of color wheel, and that is the visible spectrum. Now you'll notice here that there's actually a black zone in the magentas and say hot pinks, and that's because there's no visible light that's associated with these colors, believe it or not. Again, it's like the last color wheel. It gets into how the brain actually sees and interprets the world. See, most colors can be defined one of 2 ways. Let's take yellow as an example. Yellow can be made with a wavelength of light that is equal to yellow, as it is often done in the sun or certain kinds of light bulbs. But it can also be made by combining red and green light. Most colors work this way. They are made either with a specific wavelength for that color or the combination of 2 other colors. But it's not true for the magenta zones of colors. Those wavelengths, we do not see those wavelengths of light that would sort of correspond to them. The only way we see them is through a combination of colors, specifically colors in the red range and colors mixed with colors in the blue and purple range. I just find that really fascinating because color really isn't something that exists in the real world. It is something we put together in our mind and have to control as such. Now, there are other color wheels as well. In fact, we might even look at some in follow-up videos, but this is enough for now. And I just want to show you what happens. In traditional color theory, picking your color wheel makes an important difference. So, for example, I'm just going to use a marker here, and I'm going to say, okay, what if I start with red again? Now I'm going to draw a big oval across this thing because I want to hit every color wheel here. So there's my red colors, and they're all pretty similar. I set them up to be this way in particular. If I were to look at 3 equally spaced colors, the triadic color scheme, I would come down to this bluish zone, which isn't so bad. We can see that there's many similar shades of blue here, except for we do have one that stands out. We've got a cyan sort of popping in over here. And if I were to come to the third position, equally spacing it out, over here, we really see things start to sort of make some differences where I've got some greens, I've got some colors I might call like lime, and I've even got some yellows. And in fact, just based on the standard pattern, what color wheel you use actually does matter on the results. In traditional color theory, it doesn't really talk about this. It assumes one color wheel and it just lets you go along with it. But there are different color wheels, so we should address it. Fundamentally, we should understand maybe it doesn't much matter, because I already showed that any 2 colors go together, so it's not surprising that there's many different variations of colors that work well together. That's how color works. And you get different colors based on different color wheels. When I show my next video on how to really use patterns to develop color palettes and design, we'll actually see the color wheel doesn't matter all that much. And I sort of can remove most of the limitations of what color wheel you use anyway. And so since it doesn't matter, I will stick to the RGB since it works best for screens. Once you understand that there's limitations to color theory, you can then really start to build a new theory. So in this video, I did review the 4 limitations. In the next video, I'll show how to take patterns, understand those limitations, and build a new color theory from them. And once you've done that, you can really start to apply it to your drawings and your designs. And so I'm going to end on this particular drawing here, which I really like for a couple reasons. First of all, I really do like the colors in it. I think the yellow sky, gives a feeling of growth, morning, it's springtime, things are coming to life. It enhances the architecture in this drawing. And so using a complementary color, I use blues on the lower half of the drawing. I think it all comes together well as a composition. But at the same time, you might stop and say, hey, what's going on here? Once you think about it, there's actually a blue ground. Well, what ground is blue? That's not a choice many people would make. But in the end, it doesn't matter too much because the drawing works. Because I've controlled color theory, I've understood what colors work together, and been able to manipulate them as I want to. And that's what I hope to bring in the next video, is how to really control color theory. So thanks for watching this one, and until that one comes out, keep making great designs and keep making great drawings. Thanks.